In this demonstration, you learn how to add a row version to the friend entity to use optimistic concurrency with Entity Framework. Let's switch to Visual Studio. Here I've opened the friend organizer solution. Now let's open up the friend class and let's add a row version property to this class. So here I used the prop snippet, I pressed the tab key to close IntelliSense and again to use the snippet, and I want to define a property of type byte array. The property should have the name row version. To use this property as a row version, I need to specify the timestamp attribute on the property. When I hover this attribute, you can see that it specifies the data type of the column as a row version. Now let's save this friend entity and let's create a database migration for our change. So here in the Package Manager console, I select the Data Access project as a default project and I use the add migration command to add a migration. I call the migration edit row version to friend. And I hit enter. Now the migration has been created and you can see that the column row version is added to the friend table. When I scroll to the right, you can also see that this column is a timestamp and that the store type is row version. Now let's go again to the Package Manager console and let's use the update database command to apply these changes to the database. Now let's see what the database looks like in the Server Explorer. I go to Tables, Friend, and I right-click and I say Open Table Definition. Now the table has been opened and you can see that we have here this row version column and the data type is row version. Also in the T-SQL code, you can see that the data type of this row version column is row version and it is not null. So this column is incremented automatically by the database every time a record is updated. Due to the timestamp attribute on the row version property, Entity Framework will also include this row version in the where statement. So it will check if the row version in the database still exists. If not, Entity Framework will throw a DB update concurrency exception. Let's see this in action. So I start the application. I press the Windows key and arrow left to move this application to the left side. Now I go to the Solution Explorer and I right-click on Friend Organizer UI and I say Debug Start New Instance to start a second instance. I press Windows key and arrow right to move this application instance to the right side. Now let's open up Sarah Huber in both applications. In the left application, I change the first name to Anna. But before we click Save, I want to start an instance of SQL Server Profiler. SQL Server Profiler allows us to see the SQL statements that are sent to the database. So I just click here this little icon to create a new trace. I want to connect to my local server, which is just a dot. So I click the Connect button. The trace name Untitled1 sounds good to me and I just click Run. I maximize this trace window and I just clear the messages that we have already. Now I go to the application and I click the Save button. I click Pause because I don't want to see any other statements. Now you can see here the update command that has been sent to the database. You can see that the row version is included in the where condition. So it checks if the row version in the database is the same as the row version of this add_to parameter that is created by Entity Framework. This add_to parameter contains the row version that is loaded in the application. As it is the same, a record is found and the record has been updated. Beside the update statement, Entity Framework also uses a select statement to select the new row version from the friend table. But now let's move the SQL Server Profiler window to the left side and let's go to the other application. The first name of this friend is now in the database Anna, and I change it here to Julia. Before I click Save here, I continue my trace and I clear the existing messages. Now I click Save and we get a DB update concurrency exception in our friend detail view model where we try to save this friend. Now let's look at the statement that has been sent. This statement looks exactly like the previous statement, except that we want to set the first name here to Julia. The update statement checks for the row version in the where condition. But now this time, the row version in the database has already changed because we have updated this record from the other application instance. So the value in this add_to parameter is not the value that is stored in the database. This means no record is found to update because of this where condition. And then Entity Framework will throw this DB update concurrency exception. The exception here says entities may have been modified or deleted since entities were loaded. This is correct. this is exactly what we did. So now when we continue here, the application comes up with this unexpected error, please inform the admin. This is our common exception handler. Let's close SQL Server Profiler, and now we see the two applications again. So in the application on the right, we are not able to save that friend anymore as we get the DB update concurrency exception. This will display this message box. Now let me show you how you can handle the DB update concurrency exception so that the user can save Julia in this case, or that he can discard his changes and reload the current data from the database. In the previous clip, we have added a row version property with a timestamp attribute to the friend entity. When you try to save a friend back to the database, Entity Framework will use this row version to check if the data in the database has not changed. If the data has changed, Entity Framework will throw a DB update concurrency exception. In your code, you can handle this exception to support different scenarios. You can implement the client wins scenario where the data of the user is stored and any change in the database is just overwritten with the new data. You can also implement the scenario database wins. Here the changes of the user are just thrown away and the data is reloaded from the database. These are the two main scenarios. And of course you can also build custom logic with a mixture of both of these scenarios. For example, you can reload the data from the database and you show a kind of diff screen to the user. Then they can select what they want to keep from their changes and what they want to keep from the changes in the database. In the Friend Organizer application, I will show you now the code that allows the user to select between the two scenarios client wins and database wins. So let's switch to Visual Studio. Here I've opened the friend detail view model of the Friend Organizer UI project. As you can see, I scrolled already to the onSaveExecute method. Here I call the saveAsync method of the friend repository, and I have put this call into a try block, and I have also a corresponding catch block for the DB update concurrency exception. When this exception was thrown, I used the message dialog service to show an OK cancel dialog to the user. The user sees the message, the entity has been changed in the meantime by someone else. Click OK to save your changes anyway, click cancel to reload the entity from the database. When I scroll a bit down, you can see what I do in both cases. When the user has clicked OK, I need to update the original values that are tracked by the context of Entity Framework with the database values. This allows me to save the entity back without getting a DB update concurrency exception. So the first thing I do here, I access the entries property of the DB update concurrency exception. This entries property contains DB entity entries. I use the single method here, as I know I have just saved a single entity, the friend entity. So there will only be a single DB entity entry item in this entries property. On the DB entity entry item, I grab the original values property, and on that property I call setValues. On the entry I call getDatabaseValues to get the values from the database that I pass to that setValues method. After I did this, the original values of this DB entity entry are the current values of the database. This means that I also have the current row version of the database, which allows me to save the entity back with Entity Framework without getting a DB update concurrency exception anymore. So here you see the data of the user is stored. We have here the scenario client wins. In the else block you see the code that is executed when the user has clicked cancel in the message dialog. Then the entity is reloaded from the database. So here I use again the single method on the entries property of the DB update concurrency exception. On that DB entity entry I call the reload async method to reload the entity from the database. As you remember, Entity Framework's DB context is caching entities. So here we force the DB context to reload the entity. Then to initialize my friend detail view model correctly, I call the load async method of the friend detail view model with the ID of the loaded friend. Now the data from the database has been reloaded. At the end of this method, you can see the code that was there already before. The hasChanges property is refreshed with the return value of the hasChanges method from the friend repository. The ID value of the friend is saved in the ID property of the friend detail view model, and the raceDetailSavedEvent method is used to race the after detail saved event with the friend ID and the friend's full name. So now let's run the application and let's try this. I press Windows arrow left to move this application to the left side, and I go to the Solution Explorer and I right click on the Friend Organizer UI project and I select Debug Start New Instance from the context menu. I press the Windows key and arrow right to move this instance to the right side. Now I open up Anna Huber in both instances. On the left side, I change the first name to Sarah and I save this. On the right side, I change the first name to Julia, but the first name in the database has already been changed to Sarah. When I click Save, you can see the entity has been changed in the meantime by someone else. Click OK to save your changes anyway, click Cancel to reload the entity from the database. I click Cancel. Now you can see that the first name in this right application changed also to Sarah as the data has been reloaded from the database. Now I change the first name in the left application to Anna and I click Save. And I go to the right application again and I change it here to Julia, but in the database it has been changed to Anna in the meantime. I click Save and you can see again the message box that we have created. This time I click OK to save my changes to the database. So now the database will contain the name Julia and not Anna anymore. So when this user closes this friend and he reopens the friend again, you can see this friend is now Julia. So far to updating existing entities. Now let's see what happens when another user has deleted an entity that you try to save.